Welcome to the Ideal Vagrant. I am the Ideal Vagrant. After passionate,
The European Union was a noble
engaged,
dream.
tragic,
Jo Cox is one of Westminster's newest MPs.
acrimonious,
I want a better deal for the people of this country.
and sometimes phenomenally ridiculous campaign, the United Kingdom voted to leave the European Union on June 23rd, 2016. 43 years of membership in the European Union came to a shuddering end, sending shockwaves through Britain and the European continent as a whole. To the joy of those who long for a more traditionally or narrowly sovereign Britain,
let June the 23rd go down in our history as our Independence Day.
and to the chagrin of those more comfortable with Britain in the bosom of the European family. A flawed European family. Britain had never been the most enthusiastic member of the Union. It had been pursing its lips all the way to the altar, and to be fair, all the way to the divorce. And the other partners are well aware of this fact. It took three applications and a referendum before Britain actually settled within the European Economic Community in 1973. Commentators have theorized all kinds of things. They've theorized that the Brexit vote was about immigration, was about EU membership dues, was about parliamentary sovereignty. In other words, taking back control. The pro-EU campaign was often debated with, amongst others, statistics of economics, statistics of immigration, and of course a prospect of total economic annihilation if Britain was to leave the EU. Indeed, Homo economicus on his best day would be a member of the European Union. They saw the advantages of being a member as a rational, self-evident thing. So the result would have been logical, right? The result of the referendum, though, still came as a surprise to many. But should it have been? Britain has struggled to reconcile itself with Europe long before Prime Minister Edward Heath's pen ever landed on what is to some the second most offensive piece of paper ever held by a British Prime Minister. The most offensive piece of paper ever held by a British Prime Minister was famously held by Neville Chamberlain when he stepped off the plane and declared that there would be peace in our time. Yeah. I want to make the argument that the root cause behind Britain's difficulty with the European Union reaches at the very essence of a nation's identity. The story of how a people view their own continuous history. Understanding what's happening to the Sceptred Isle today means understanding the British narrative since the Second World War. We must dial back the clocks. We must look into the past and take a trip down memory lane. Britain survived the war but paid a heavy price. Seeing off the Nazis sealed empire's fate. Empire transitioned to Commonwealth. The sun did set on the British Empire after all. The morning after really left a nation facing one hell of a come down. On a nation's Suicide Tuesday, a fundamentally and quintessentially human question is posed. Who are we, and who do we want to be? As individuals, we pose ourselves these questions automatically. And on an abstract level, so do societies. Societies have to ask themselves the question of who or what they are through the topics of public debate. As societies aren't monoliths, the answer to this question varies. And the struggle to determine the direction of a country is often informed by how different sections of society imagine that answer. Broadly generalizing, after the war, Britain regarded itself on one hand as plucky Britain, resisting on its own a formidable terror which had once again overrun the continent. In essence, the good old stiff upper lip.
We've been bombed, dive bombed, high-level bombed, machine gunned, been through 2 invasion scares. The last lot we had the house down about our ears. But we're still sticking it, and we're going to stick it.
There were those who regarded themselves as a great Atlantic power, a bridge between the US and the continent, with its eyes still firmly set on the world, not yet having come to terms with actually controlling much less of it. As fate would have it, a former colony and a distrusted wartime ally, Uncle Sam and Uncle Joe, replaced Britain as the preeminent superpowers of our world, heralding a new age, the Cold War. The endeavor of the battered and bruised continental Europeans towards the ideal of European Union was generally supported by the British elites and the British public. Winston Churchill himself, in a speech, advocated a United States of Europe.
We cannot aim at anything less than the union of Europe as a whole, and we look forward with confidence to the day when that union will be achieved.
However, Britain and her empire were to be with Europe, but not in Europe. A friend, but not an actual bedfellow. In this view, it had no real interest in joining the European community's predecessor. It would accept an entity that had the ability to supersede the Westminster Parliament, in essence surrendering its traditional sovereignty over strategic war industries. In essence, British eyes were still firmly set on empire, which in this new post-war age came to be called the British Commonwealth. It chose to navigate the post-war era first on its own economically through the Commonwealth trade arrangements, and politically with the help of the special relationship. In 1957, the Rome Treaty was signed and thus created the European Economic Community, expanding the European coal and steel community to touch upon more economic sectors and to finally embark upon a ever closer union, politically and economically. British economic growth in the 50s and 60s was actually remarkably under the average of the countries that were part of the European Economic Community. Plagued by economic troubles, the common market that the Six were cooking up on the continent beckoned like the scent of a freshly baked Belgian waffle. The UK launched its first accession request in 1961 under a conservative government. But President of France, Charles de Gaulle, suspicious of Britain's motives, demands, and dedication to the European project, said non, thus vetoing the accession. The second request came in 1967 under a Labour government led by Prime Minister Harold Wilson. UK political and economic instability provided the general with an excellent stick with which to beat the British and dash hopes of accession. The legendary general's passing in 1970 was met with a conflicted sigh of relief in different European capitals. And thus, the third request in 1973, under the conservative government of Prime Minister Edward Heath, was accepted. Accession attempts were thus made by governments of both parties. Conservative in 1961, Labour in 1967, and Conservative again in 1973. Resistance to those accession attempts came from within both parties. The European Economic Community consistently enjoyed higher rates of growth and greater stability, and as such looked like a very attractive club to join. The Tories and Labour greatly emphasized the economic benefits to the population, although admittedly from differing points of view. The Tories were taken to the benefits of free trade, the open market, whilst Labour emphasized the protective nature of the European project. However, both parties were worried about the effects of joining the European Economic Community on the traditional sovereignty of the United Kingdom. So in the opposition to joining the European community, sovereignty was a common denominator. Sovereignty represents the extent to which a nation can determine its own destiny. In practice, sovereignty is limited by circumstances. Does absolute sovereignty exist if exercising it means having a cold winter? If exercising it means having a starving population? Intergovernmental organizations like the European Economic Community, which became the EU, are essentially exercises in pooling sovereignty. States relinquish some of their sovereignty, some of their authorities to a single entity. So their real sovereignty, although reduced, is still actually within their control. The argument in favor is the realization that absolute sovereignty does not exist in our reality. It is a theoretical construct. Control over resources is not equally spread over the world, creating factual interdependence. Europe cannot keep warm in winter without Russia. Neither can the Latin American or Caribbean economies escape the economic necessities of trading with Uncle Sam to the north. The UK entered the EU with a fair amount of chagrin, arguably joining only when public debate settled not on the virtues of European integration and the ideal of a United States of Europe, but on the economic benefits that membership might bestow. Essentially, the sceptred isle itself would, to quote Lady Hillingdon, lie down, open its legs, and think of England. The factors which made accession so contested never actually disappeared from the fray. The British self-image as distinct from the continent, an Atlantic power looking out to the world and not navel-gazing at its own continent, remained important. The press played an important role in mirroring and reinforcing that perception. In the face of its own declining power, latching onto a culturally familiar superpower allowed the national consciousness to stave off the debates about who we are without empire. The national discourse, driven by a press largely in the hands of aristocratic dynasties, led by people such as the Lords Rothermere and Beaverbrook, and the Viscounts Camrose and Kemsley, can be forgiven for not straying too far from the interests, ideas, and values of their owners, of their elite section of British society. Aristocrats and large landholders actively undermined the efforts for the abolition of the House of Lords and other institutions of inherited privilege. Industrialists looked on in horror at the emerging, tightly regulated social democracies and welfare states that were being established across the Channel. The moneyed elite then played an important role in reinforcing and shaping the British public's perception of the EU. The British tabloids, having prominent readership among the working class, have over the years been sources of a multitude of incendiary, misleading myths and stories about the EU. Despite legitimate criticism of the EU, successive British governments maintained ambivalent attitudes as the cleavages present at accession remained as salient as ever. Successive British governments consistently weakened and opted out of the more social and federalist chapters of EU treaties. Actions favoring open markets, open deregulated markets, are a boon for globalization and financial markets. But without corrective mechanisms, they can cause outsourcing, deindustrialization, and a downward wage pressure, which can create a class of those left behind. Shortly after accession, the Thatcher government pushed heavily domestically and internationally for free trade, open, deregulatory policies as a vanguard for freer global markets, and saw the partially protectionist common market as a threat to that. In the realm of political sovereignty, the problem lay not with anecdotal examples of where freedom of governance is restricted by Brussels, but with the narrative of having to accept laws from, or in cooperation with, the continent that brought forth the tyrannies of Napoleon and Hitler. After all, Britannia sails on her own. Viscount Palmerston famously said, "Britain has no eternal allies, nor eternal enemies. Our interests are eternal, and our interests it is our duty to follow." It had always been a marriage of convenience. In the wake of the Great Recession, deindustrialization, European economic migration, the benefits of membership became far less clear to far more people. Successive governments failed to redistribute the benefits of economic growth, the benefits of membership, to people across the country, as evidenced by the increasing economic inequality across the nation. Britain's European story came to an end with a close vote, though, indicating how divided the public is on the European issue. As I said before, nations are not monoliths. A public does not move or think in lockstep. Half the British population came to the idea that their economic interests remain with the EU, even if a far smaller number of that proportion actually believes in the political ideal of an ever closer union. A phrase that touches at the heart of identity more than cold numbers do. The Brexit vote was surprising because it broke with the status quo, but it should not have been surprising. Analogous to individuals, questions of national identity are neither easy nor quick to resolve, but important to tackle nonetheless. Britannia herself is struggling to know what to do if she can no longer rule the waves the way she used to. She must ask herself what control means. Can she have legal, parliamentary, and democratic sovereignty, but be also independent of the whims of the international, bigger actors? I don't know. But it's for Britannia to figure out on her own. Thank you.